Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 798, and today is May 14th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show. I was filling in for Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com yesterday, so I have several of my own articles to go through and break down on today's show. So be sure you share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reposted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And of course, subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. This is my second show where I typically am interviewing guests and breaking down the clips and other major stories going on. And today will be Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute returning. So you won't want to miss that. Again, subscribe to the show. It's the first link in the show notes page. And then today at 4:45, tune in live and, be active in the comments and let us know what you think about the show. All right, starting off here, and I'm sure I will be asking Dan about this later today, Trump slams neocons and nation builders in Saudi speech. President Trump traveled to Saudi Arabia for the first foreign trip of his second administration. During an address in the Gulf Kingdom, Trump slammed neocons in Iran while also weighing in on Ukraine and Syria. So this is a longer quote, but I think it's just worth it to read the whole quote of what Trump said here. He said, "It's crucial for the wider world to know this great transformation has not come from Western interventionists or flying people in beautiful planes giving you lectures on how to live and how to govern your own affairs. In the end, these so-called nation builders read far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they didn't even understand themselves. No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spend trillions of dollars failing to develop Baghdad and many other cities." So I think this is a pretty amazing quote to hear from an American president. He's really indicting the U.S. foreign policy over the past 3 decades or so in the Middle East. The Iraq war failure, the Afghan war failure, the failure of the Syrian war, Libya, Somalia. Of course, we'll get into Syria a little bit more in a minute here, but just to say that, he is saying that the policies of the past were failures. It is really important that he acknowledges and understands that. Even if his policy later to that day doesn't always reflect that understanding, that he at least is able to articulate this, say this, and somewhere in his brain knows that this is true. I do think it's a very important quality to have in the president. So I don't want to flatter Trump too much. And you know what? We'll go ahead and jump here first. So one of those failed nation building projects, of course, is the war in Syria. And Jason Ditz wrote this for antiwar.com on May 13th. Trump will lift all sanctions on Syria, will meet HTS leader on Wednesday. And that meeting did happen. There's a picture of Trump, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, and Ahmed al-Shara, or better known as Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, the president of Syria and the creator of Al-Qaeda in Syria. And so that, look, I'm not in support of sanctions, economic warfares on other countries, and I'm typically not too concerned about the American government doing something to bestow legitimacy on another nation. However, in this case where you actually do have a government that, look, is not only ruled by Al-Qaeda, because if that's really what the Syrian people wanted, that would be a different story, but had an Al-Qaeda government thrust upon them from Western intervention, from decades of the U.S. pouring in billions of dollars in arms and money, Turkey funneling the jihadists from other battlefields across the Middle East and Asia, from Chechnya to Libya to Somalia to Iraq. All these hardened jihadists were allowed to cross into and become, the backbone of the al-Nusra Front or Al-Qaeda in Syria under Jolani. And so that Trump is now embracing this president again, going and meeting with him and not saying that, look, this guy is Al Qaeda. We had a bounty on him up until 10 minutes ago. And during the Iraq War, if we had blown him up in an airstrike, or even during the Syrian war, had we killed him in an airstrike, we probably would have celebrated as taking out a member of Al Qaeda's leadership. And so to embrace Jolani in this way is just utterly disgusting and quite frankly very concerning, that we are giving more credibility to a government that is the real opposition, the real threat to the American people. The Al-Qaeda jihadist movement still does exist. And so to have an entire government of this ideology led by a veteran of the Iraq War, he didn't fight on the American side, by the way, now in charge of Syria, is at least something that should concern our government and the American people. And that our government is embracing Jolani rather than rejecting him is telling. It's also telling, of course, that Trump maintained sanctions and actually put a very strict sanctions campaign in place on the former leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And look, Bashar al-Assad is no hero. There are people in the West who give him way too much credit. He was a brutal dictator. However, he was secular. He didn't, enforce a government upon Syria that was of an Islamist ideology that we've already seen roaming around the Alawite areas of Syria and murdering thousands of Alawite civilians. And so this is just really problematic. So back to my article here. The comparison of the Iraqi and Saudi capitals is notable, as the U.S. spent trillions of dollars fighting a war in Iraq and attempting to rebuild the country as a Western democracy. That project is widely regarded as a failure that led to the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. The president also discussed his engagement with Iran during his address. He said, "I want to make a deal with Iran. If I can make a deal with Iran, I'll be very happy. We're going to make your region and the world a safer place. But if Iran's leadership rejects this olive branch and continues to attack their neighbors, then we will have no choice but to inflict maximum pressure." And so I'm not sure if this massive maximum pressure is any different from Trump's maximum pressure campaign that he already had on Iran. If it isn't, if it's just the same thing, then he's threatening more sanctions, which is almost a walk down from his previous position that if Iran doesn't accept a deal, then we're going to a war with Iran. Maybe adding the extra adjective massive to the maximum pressure is Trump implying that it would be a military operation if Iran doesn't accept a deal. So, the problem here when it comes to negotiations with Iran is twofold. One is the U.S. is trying to impose unreasonable demands on Iran. Iran wants to have a civilian nuclear program that is self-sufficient. And having a nuclear program that is self-sufficient, meaning you have the ability to enrich your own uranium, would put Iran's nuclear program in the same category as Germany, Brazil, and Japan. Now, that does mean you also have all the parts to get the raw materials for a nuclear weapon if you chose to try to develop a nuclear bomb. Of course, you still need a delivery system, you still need to test the bomb, and I'm sure there's a million other very complicated steps that I don't understand between just having a civilian nuclear energy program and building a nuclear weapon. But that being said, you could enrich the uranium to the necessary quality and enough parts if you do have a nuclear program, again, that is similar to the one that the Iranians, the Germans, the Brazilians, and the Japanese have. So Trump is trying to further restrict that and say that Iran cannot have an enrichment program. And the Iranians are saying that, this is critical to our sovereignty. So we're going to have an enrichment program. We're not going to give that up. And in that case, then I'm not sure how the U.S. moves forward here with the Iranians, attempting to enforce this deal upon them. Now, something else that I think is notable here and was actually a little bit surprising to me. This is another article that I wrote for antiwar.com yesterday, May 13th. 70% of Americans support a nuclear deal with Iran. So a new poll found a large majority of Americans across the political spectrum support reaching a deal with Iran that allows Tehran to maintain a peaceful nuclear program. According to the University of Maryland Critical Issues poll, 69% of Americans favor reaching a nuclear deal with Iran. Nearly 2/3 of Republicans and over 3/4 of Democrats said they want a negotiated agreement limiting Iran's nuclear program to peaceful ends with stringent monitoring. So this is essentially describing the JCPOA, which is the 2015 Iran nuclear deal that Obama signed and Trump withdrew from during his first administration. It's also notable that under a quarter of Republicans and just 5% of Democrats support using military force to take out Iran's nuclear program. And again, this is, I think, very problematic for Trump, because the best deal he could get is the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which he heavily criticized when he was running for president the first time and then ended up withdrawing from in 2018. And so if he goes back to it, he essentially admits that this whole Iran fear-mongering and threatening over the past decade has essentially been for nothing, or I guess only 7 years at this point, has essentially all been for nothing. And I think practically our best hope here is everything ends up frozen, where Trump doesn't sign a new deal with the Iranians, and at the same time, he doesn't follow through on his pledge to go to war with Iran. I really do think that's the best hope when it comes to Iran. Now, last up here, the poll asked a second question, which was, what is the best situation to bring stability to the Middle East? The options that they gave were only Israel having nuclear weapons, only Iran having nuclear weapons, neither having nuclear weapons, or both having nuclear weapons. And listen to these numbers. This is, again, if you're watching the show, look at the screen here for a second. Look at these poll returns. So only 10% of all respondents said that Israel having nuclear weapons was the ideal situation. That was 20% of Republicans and 5% of Democrats. And that is the status quo, that only Israel has nuclear weapons. And so it's very interesting that only 10% of Americans support that. Now, I wonder what percentage of all respondents actually know that Israel does have nuclear weapons. My guess is that probably more Republicans than Democrats do, but that number is fairly low. Now, only Iran having nuclear weapons was not something that 1% of Americans said, so that's a margin of error thing. Neither having nuclear weapons was the ideal outcome for 69% of Americans. That includes 63% of Republicans and 75% of Democrats. And so again, I'm not sure if you went around and asked these 63% of Republicans, do you think Israel should give up their nuclear weapons, what they would say, but certainly they are saying that the preferable situation for Washington would be neither having nuclear weapons. Now, I found it a little bit interesting too that 6%, but 7% of Republicans actually favor both countries having nuclear weapons. And, again, I just thought those poll results were very interesting, so I wanted to go through them. But anyways, Trump going to war with Iran is highly unpopular. That was one of the main points that I want to make here. All right, so last up from my first article here is just mentioning that additionally, Trump said that a top American official would travel to Turkey on Thursday for major talks between Russia and Ukraine. Trump explained, our people are going to be there. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is going to be there. Others are going to be, and we're going to see if we could get it done. When he says others, I really do hope he's referring to Steve Witkoff, who I think has a far more reasonable position when it comes to the war in Ukraine than does Marco Rubio. The whole development of these talks was interesting as well. As President Putin proposed the talks, Zelensky rejected them, and then Trump put pressure on Zelensky and says Zelensky should accept the talks, and he did. So, at least in the past couple of days, Trump's foreign policy has seemed marginally better than it did last weekend for the few months before. And so this is interesting. And, you know, I don't want to be overly optimistic and to just buy into everything that's Trump's saying and try to read everything as in the best light as possible for Donald Trump. But at the same time, even looking at this with a critical eye, you can't deny that minus the Syria part here, denouncing the nation building and sending a representative for the Russia-Ukraine talks, I do think are steps in the right direction. Now, let's get into the last thing I have from Trump's Saudi trip. Trump signs major weapons and investment deals with Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration announced a massive weapon sale to Saudi Arabia worth nearly $142 billion, calling it the largest ever defense agreement in history. In exchange, Riyadh gave assurances it would go ahead with $600 billion in investments in the United States. The White House announced the deals on Tuesday as Trump visited the Gulf Kingdom, noting they would cover energy, defense, mining, and technology. It said the weapons would provide Saudi Arabia with state-of-the-art warfighting equipment and services from over a dozen U.S. firms. The $142 billion military package will help Riyadh upgrade its air force and missile defenses, coastal security, space capabilities, as well as its communication systems, and will include extensive training and support to build the capacity of the Saudi armed forces, and this was all according to the White House fact sheet. So in addition to receiving weapons and gear from more than 12 U.S. arms makers, a senior Boeing official told Saudi state TV on Tuesday that Saudi Arabia could soon be integrated into the global supply chain for the F-15EX fighter jet, though offered few details. Last year, the company said it was weighing a potential sale of F-15EXs to the kingdom, as well as deals to upgrade its existing fleet. So Trump also announced some other deals with the United Arab Emirates while he was in the Middle East. And of course, this coverage is from Will Porter. He was writing at antiwar.com yesterday. All right, now let's get into these next few articles that I have here on the situation in Gaza. They're all horrific news. Starting with this one, Israeli cabinet approves de facto annexation of large portion of the West Bank. So the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a resolution that will give Tel Aviv full control over Area C of the West Bank. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich touted the decision as de facto annexation over half of the West Bank. So on Tuesday, the Israeli Security Cabinet gave Smotrich the authority to reclassify portions of Area C, which make up 60% of the West Bank, as state land. And so Smotrich explained his new powers. As a part of the normalization and de facto sovereignty resolution we're leading, the cabinet has approved a historic decision. For the first time, Israel has taken sovereign responsibility for the territory and launching formal land recognition. This will provide legal certainty, support settlement expansion, block the Palestinian Authority's takeover efforts, and eliminate the threat of a Palestine terrorist state. And of course, when he says Palestinian terrorist state, he just means a Palestinian state. So Smotrich is himself an Israeli settler who has called for the expansion of more settlements. His plan for the West Bank includes giving the Palestinians the choice between subjugation, immigration, and death. Smotrich has repeatedly advocated for lethal force to be used against even Palestinian children. Area C was a designation created by the 1995 Oslo Accords. Under the deal, the Palestinian Authority was scheduled to take over the area. However, Tel Aviv has never relinquished control. Defense Minister Israel Katz said the Security Cabinet's decision means Tel Aviv will never hand over control of Area C to the Palestinian Authority. He stated, "This decision halts the Palestinian Authority's takeover over Area C land and enables the Defense Ministry to lead formal land recognition in the West Bank. The Israeli government is also moving forward with other measures to expand Israeli settlements in the West Bank while delegitimizing Palestinian land ownership. The Israeli outlet Haaretz described Tel Aviv's actions as enabling Palestinian dispossession. One such move is to disqualify all the land recognition done by the Palestinian Authority. And so imagine if your government came in and said that your house title, it's meaningless. I know you worked with the Palestinian Authority and provided all this documentation that proved that your family had been on and owned this land and this house for millennia. However, we don't care. That's meaningless. And now we're going to do all of our own documentation. And it turns out that we say your house actually belongs to this Jewish guy who just moved here from Brooklyn. Goodbye. And we're kicking you off of your land. If you resist, we will kill you. That is what Israel is effectively announcing here. So, along with annexation in the West Bank, Israel is plotting genocide in Gaza. Netanyahu says Israel will finish the war in Gaza, drive out 50% of Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel would complete its military objectives in Gaza and force out at least 50% of the population. On Tuesday, Netanyahu said even if Israel agrees to a temporary pause for the release of hostages, it will resume military operations in Gaza. He said, "We in the coming days will be entering with all of our strength to complete the process to subdue Hamas. It could be that Hamas will say, pause, we want to release another 10 hostages. Okay, release them. We will receive them and enter after that. But there will not be a situation where we stop the war." Hamas has long sought a deal with Tel Aviv to release the hostages in exchange for a permanent end to the conflict. Israel has repeatedly rejected this proposal and often sabotaged diplomatic efforts to stop the fighting and free Israeli captives. Last week, Haaretz reported that freeing the captives was the least important Israeli military objective in Gaza. Removing Palestinians from the Strip was listed as a higher priority. In his remarks, Netanyahu confirmed that Tel Aviv was working to fund countries to take in Palestinian refugees, believing that at least half of them could be forced out of their homeland. But there is one problem: we need countries to receive them. This is what we are working on right now. If you give them an exit, I am telling you more than 50% of them will leave. In my opinion, much more. Many top Israeli officials have said throughout the military campaign that as a result of the conflict must be the removal of the civilian population from Gaza. Washington and Tel Aviv have approached a number of countries about taking in the Palestinians. However, so far, no country has publicly stated a willingness to accept Palestinian refugees. While Tel Aviv has framed the removal of Palestinians from Gaza as voluntary migration, the reality is that Israel has used a massive bombing and starvation campaign to create a famine in the Strip. The World Health Organization reports 75% of Palestinian children have starved to death since early March. Gaza is currently under a full Israeli blockade with no food, fuel, or medicine entering the Strip since March 2nd. Community kitchens and aid organizations have shuttered due to a lack of supplies, leaving millions without access to food. At the same time, Israel has unleashed a ruthless air war on Gaza. On Tuesday, Israeli warplanes pummeled the European hospital and surrounding area. So, a little bit more on the European hospital. This was written by Connor Freeman, May 13th at antiwar.com. Israel launches 9 bunker-busting missiles at Gaza's European hospital. So Israeli security officials stated that Tel Aviv launched 9 bunker-busting missiles into and around the courtyard of the southern Gaza's European hospital near Khan Yunis on Tuesday. At least 28 people have been killed and another 70 wounded, including journalists hit with shrapnel. So a medical student living in a house near the hospital posted on social media describing the terror during the attack. "My heart almost stopped. A continued belt of fire. We started running from one corner to another, shouting at each other to gather in one place. I could not feel my ears from the force of the successive explosions. The fire of the bombs lit up everywhere, even though it was not night. As the Washington Post noted, the hospital is one of Gaza's largest. It has frequently housed displaced Palestinians along with patients and staff over the course of the war. It was knocked out of service in July after the Israeli military ordered its evacuation, then reopened in August with the help of PalMed Europe, a Paris-based nonprofit of Palestinian doctors. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported that the Shin Bet and the IDF released a joint statement asserting that the Israeli strike was intended to hit a command and control center beneath the hospital. Of course, no evidence has been provided of this, and this is something Israeli has lied about in the past. So social media footage shows large explosions taking place when the missiles made impact with the European hospital. Other videos show Palestinians attempting to recover people buried under the sand after the bombing. The Israeli army claims that the attack was also an assassination attempt on the life of Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of former Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who was killed by the IDF in Rafah last October. There is as yet no verification on whether Mohammed Sinwar was killed on the strike or if he was indeed present anywhere near the alleged strike, at the site of the strike. So drop site report on secondary strikes at the hospital, which target civilian defense workers. And, this means they killed the people that come to dig people out of the rubble, or the paramedics who come and try to save lives. Additionally, a video posted by a British surgeon, Tom Podokar, said that the hospital was also damaged in the strike and bringing patients into the operating theater for treatment is no longer possible. And absolutely horrific what Israel is doing here. Now, one update since the last show, and that is the release of Edon Alexander. He was the last U.S. Or American Israeli citizen that was held by Hamas. He, of course, was an IDF soldier who was taken captive on October 7th while he was on active duty, I believe, at a military base. And so he was a prisoner of war. Still good that he was released. Israel is saying that they're not pausing the fighting, and this is in no way part of a ceasefire. This was a goodwill gesture on the part of Hamas, which will not be reciprocated by Tel Aviv. It is, the bad story here is somewhat interesting with the U.S., previously engaging in these negotiations with the Palestinians, with Hamas, right? And Adam Bowler was talking to Hamas about this and nearly had Edon out at, I think probably mid-March would have been when he was released. But the Israelis came in and blew up those negotiations, said it was unacceptable that the U.S. was trying to negotiate Edon's release separate from a deal with Israel. And apparently one of the reasons that Israel was upset is they were afraid that Trump would lose interest in the war in Gaza if there were no Americans held there. I don't think that's necessarily true. I'm not sure Edon was really that valuable to Donald Trump that he would, base his decision whether to fight that war or not solely on if he was held by Hamas. However, the Israeli thinking, I think, is important to highlight. Last up here, Israel attacks Yemen's Hodeida port, Houthi Interior Ministry says. And so it does seem that Israel is picking up somewhat on the war after the Trump administration said, well, the Houthis aren't attacking our ships, we're not going to attack the Houthis, which of course would have been the status quo. The Houthis would never start attacking our ships under the Trump administration had Trump not started bombing the Houthis in the first place. So I guess, not necessarily bad news here. This is just goes to show that it seems this war between Yemen and Israel, it will hopefully remain just between Yemen and Israel. My understanding is the Houthis are continuing to fire missiles at Israel, including one just this morning. All right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Remember, we're back with the Kyle Anzalone Show, 4:45 Eastern Time Zone on May 14th. That's Wednesday. The great Daniel McAdams is returning to the show. I can't wait to ask Dan about Trump's speech in Riyadh and what he thinks about the direction of the Trump administration and his current foreign policy. Thanks, everyone.